Okay, welcome everybody. So we're going to get started. Thank you for your patience, and I do want to just welcome everyone back here to the library's Lapham meeting room. All of those out there on Zoom joining us virtually, welcome as well. My name is Jeff Zay. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator with the Port Washington Library, and I want to wish everybody a happy Friday. You should pat yourselves on the back. You made it through another week. So we are well into our second month now of hybrid programs, and we're glad to have you joining us from wherever you may be. For those of you joining us on Zoom, we do have you muted, but as always, you can type any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll read those out during the Q&A at the end. We do have the closed caption feature turned on for today's program, but you can turn that feature off if you wish. And for those of you here in person, when we get to the Q&A, I'll ask that you raise your hand, and I'll come around with a microphone so that everyone can hear your question. Also, for those here in person, please just take a moment to silence your cell phone during the program. So I want to let you know about some upcoming programs, and then we'll get right to today's event. So tomorrow at 3 p.m. is our artist talk with our current exhibiting artist, Lori Horowitz. For those in person, you just passed her work in the gallery. Her work is, as I said, currently on display, and she will be discussing her use of eclectic techniques and materials, as well as discussing her creative process. That's going to be a hybrid program tomorrow with both in-person and Zoom audience. Then next week, Thursday, April 7th at 4 p.m., we're starting a new event. This is a 60-plus singles discussion group. As I said, a new program. The group will be led by Lillian Strassman, a licensed social worker, therapist, and life coach. And the topic for the April 7th discussion will be Stress Happens, Your Response is a Choice. So that's just an in-person only event on the 7th at 4 p.m. Next Friday for our sandwich stand, we'll be with Ron Brown. He's going to be returning with his latest series on New York City with an exploration of the history of the Easter Parade. So that'll be a hybrid program coming up next Friday. We have a lot more coming up in April, including a Earth Day celebration down at Sunset Park. That'll be Sunday, April 24th from 2 to 4 p.m. Lots of other good stuff coming up in April. So before we begin, I'll just let you know a little bit about our presenter today. Art historian Dennis Raverty specializes in work from the period between the world wars. His first book, Struggle Over the Modern, was published in 2005. His articles and criticism have appeared in Art in America, Art Journal, and Art Papers, where he was a contributing editor, as well as other publications. He authored 4 entries for the most recent edition of the Grove Encyclopedia of American Art, published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Raverty is an associate professor at New Jersey City University, where he teaches 19th and 20th century art history, the art of West Africa, the diaspora, and African American art, as well as the Renaissance and Baroque periods in Europe. An award-winning teacher, Raverty lives in New York City and is currently co-authoring a book on American illustration with Dennis Dietrich, former president of the Society of Illustrators. And we're very happy to welcome back for the first time here in person in several years for an exploration of the life and work of Howard Pyle, considered by many to be the father of American illustration. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dennis Raverty.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for coming today, and welcome to everybody both here and at home. I'm Dr. Raverty, and although my specialty is actually the period between the wars, the modernist field includes the 19th and 20th century. And for the last 10 years, I've been involved with Dennis Dietrich, who is an illustrator, on a book on the history of illustration, American illustration. And one of the things that I found very unusual when I came into the field was how little scholarly work there was on American illustration. There are a lot of coffee table books about Howard Pyle, but most of them are not by art historians, and most of those treatments of illustrators, whether it be Norman Rockwell or Howard Pyle or Ralph Schoonover or N.C. Wyeth or anybody, is they tend to be biographically based. They talk about where they were born, they fell in love, they first went to Europe, and so forth. But it kind of is a biographical treatment that doesn't look at the larger context that it's in. And that's what we're trying to do with this book, is to put all these kind of into the larger context of late 19th and 20th century art. Now, I'm what's called a social historian of art. And that means that when I'm trying to interpret the meaning of a piece, I'm always looking at the social context that it's happening within. What are the market concerns? What are some of the ideas that are current at the time, including ideas that are wrong, right? A lot of racist ideas, for example, that were considered to be science in the 1920s, and in the 2020s, we see clearly now that that's not it. One of the things I found very interesting when I started to look at the literature about the extant literature on illustration was that, I lost my train of thought. This happened since I turned 60. Well, it's just to put it into that I know what I was going to say. For a social historian of art, illustration is one of the most fascinating types of art because it is so engaged with its social surroundings in a way that pure painting isn't. For example, Van Gogh, I'm sure you're familiar with. Van Gogh, although his brother was an art dealer in Paris, a very successful art dealer, he could never sell any of his work. Yet he could continue to practice his work because he got an allowance from his brother and so forth. And he was able to do that. Illustration is much more market driven. There's an art director, there's an advertisement, there's a story. You have there are these constraints that you have in illustration because there's always kind of a text to work with. But another way, so it's not only looking at the social context of the art as it comes up, but also looking at the technological development. Because in the 19th century, the development of print-making techniques and paper-making techniques went viral and became very widespread. So that by the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of magazines and there was a high level of quality color reproduction. And one of the things that's interesting about Howard Pyle is he's right there at the forefront of the technological changes as they're happening. And he kind of lays the foundation and sets the parameters for professionalism in these various things that he's trying to do. So sometimes this period is called the golden age of illustration. That is from about 1880 to about 1920, where we have the Book Beautiful movement and all these technological developments. Let me, however, do what none of these biographical treatments do, is give you an overview of the period from what I can make out of it. First of all, there's the National Academy of Design in New York City, which originally was, and it's a school, right? The most prestigious and most difficult to get in school, the National Academy. And it was originally founded by artists of the Hudson River School, that is, romantic landscapists from the 19th century, like Albert Bierstadt, who did this beautiful and huge painting, bigger than the image we see here at the Metropolitan. There are these big, romantic, lush, fantasy depictions of life sort of untouched by white people yet, kind of as he imagines it once was. And the mountains even remind a little of the Alps that Bierstadt was from. However, by the 1880s, the Hudson River School seemed to the people at that time to be passé. It seemed to be too provincial, too American. So the Academy had become very conservative by the end of the century. And they were the people who were responsible for training. And the type of work that they liked was kind of work that we generally do not like. They were very influenced by French academic painting, like this one, which is a Bacchanal. This is the Young Bacchus, and it's by Bouguereau. And it's a big painting. It's technically marvelous, but it's very kind of vapid in the sense of it's not very deep. But yet, they thought that things that looked too American, especially illustrators like Russell or Remington that did, Native Americans and cowboys and stuff like that. They thought that was too provincial. They wanted to be universal, so they looked at the French school with its kind of very tired academicism. And one of the leading artists of the time was Kenyon Cox, an artist who's almost completely forgotten now, but was a very important and influential academician. And he did paintings like this, which I find a very boring painting, so it's all right if you don't like it. And what it is, I think this is the ancient world over on the left, that figure, allegorical figure, and then this is the modern world over on the right, and they're wearing Renaissance costumes. And in the middle, this woman takes the lamp of, I guess, art, and shielding it from the wind, transfers it from the ancients to the moderns. Yeah, technically, it's a tour de force. But as far as an innovative painting, it's very backwards looking. It very much thinks that the Renaissance figured it all out, and we're just going to keep doing it. In fact, this movement, or whatever you call it, this tendency is sometimes called the American Renaissance, because they thought there was going to be a Renaissance, but it didn't happen. This is some of his mural work, and I'm sorry, this is very pixelated. I just wanted to show you it in situ, because he does a lot of these murals. And he also did posters for First World War. Here's one of the posters. And I don't know about you, but this would not make me sign up. This is too boring. And you compare it to another, like, look at this one. Also recruitment from the First World War. Which side of the window are you? Are you man enough to stand up and fight for democracy the way that your buddies are? And the stark, it's in they're the same time. So this was a very backward-looking movement, and we've almost forgotten it now. But it was the establishment that everyone was kind of working against at the time. So if we leave this academic stuff we don't like too much out of the picture, it's like we're taking the heart out of the social situation, and we kind of don't understand why people were rebelling or what they were rebelling against, because we've almost forgotten these artists of the new Renaissance. Opposed to them were, on the one hand, the realists like Thomas Eakins and Winslow Homer, who wanted to show things real, not Greek goddesses and all that sort of stuff, but real people. And then the other hand, there's this kind of latter-day romantics. And we find this in France in the symbolist movement, for example, internationally. But we find these two tendencies that are both against the academic conservatism. Both of these tendencies happen in illustration as well. And the realists are basically newspapermen, who, like Homer, like Winslow Homer, who came into the field as a reporter, as a visual reporter, because photography couldn't capture moving images at that time. So we have the realists. And that was what Kenyon Cox was dead against, realism. It's vulgar, it shows, poor people, people have dirty feet and stuff like that. It's not as uplifting as this other stuff. But then these latter-day romantics too, and we find Howard Pyle very much is in this. He does everything except the contemporary times. He's always going back to Sherwood Forest or to pirates, his swashbuckling stories, his fantasies of children's stories and so forth. So he's very much a romantic, someone who wants to not face reality, wants to use art as a haven for those who are distressed and want to. They don't want to see more realism. They're trying to escape from reality as part of their artistic aesthetic thing. So we have these two things going against the middle. And then what we have happen is that in 1913, modern art hits. The Armory Show from Europe hits New York and so now modern art is on the books, and one by one, these things fade away. So that by 1950, modern art is the only thing that's considered really viable. Now, my job, I don't agree with that. I like modern art. I love Picasso. I love all that stuff. I'm not trying to overturn anything, but I think it's too narrow. I think we need to expand this canon from what it is. And I tell you, who has been very influential in my generation of art historians are women art historians. When I was younger, it was an old boy network, and it's not that way anymore. Most PhDs coming out of Princeton and Rutgers and Harvard and so forth are women. And women have expanded the discourse by including women that we just had overlooked. I'm kind of part of that same movement. And I first was interested in African American art because it seemed to me at that time that people just weren't integrating that in. It was kind of a specialty thing. And anyway, so that's kind of how I'm kind of always looking for people who've been left out of the discourse. It's not because I'm trying to overturn modern art. It's because I just think it's a little too narrow. And as we get more and more away from it, we should be able to, widen the circle and be appreciative of the kind of heterogeneity and the rich diversity of art. And we can talk more about why this happened at some point. But we want to talk about this golden age of illustration, as it's called, usually about from 1880 to 1920, or at least until the beginning of the First World War. Now, one of the most important things, the rapid expansion of the publishing industry after the Civil War ended in 1865. Before the Civil War, there were just over 700 periodicals, magazines, weeklies, and newspapers that were being produced in the United States. By 1890, there were over 5,000 periodicals being published in the United States. It was a really large industry. And part of this, a lot of this was technological development. For example, they found that they could make paper out of wood pulp. Before, paper had been made out of linen rags and rag paper, and it's very good paper, but wood pulp paper is much cheaper. So they could print a lot more things more cheaply. And as the century went on, more and more innovations happened in the industry. Now, at the beginning of the burgeoning of this golden age, the field was dominated by women illustrators. And that's something we almost don't remember because they were sort of eclipsed by the male artists later on. But this was because women could be trained to do, drawing, and they did it in vocational schools, typically. There was this vocational school dedicated just to women. In New York City, there was another one in Philadelphia, I forget their names. And they teach you how to do different things that you could apply to your work. And so during the 1870s and 1880s, illustration became kind of, and it's Michelle Bogert, it's a woman art historian who actually laid all this out about the feminization of it, because it was thought that real men don't do illustration. It's more like for women. One of the most important reasons is women were skilled, but you could pay them much, much less, right? And that was the way they rationalized that, is that a woman doesn't have to support a family. If a woman is single or widowed or whatever, then she just takes care of herself. She just needs a modest income. If but men have to be the breadwinner. Men have to support a family. So if you're going to pay men to do illustration, you have to pay them enough that they could support a family. With women, that wasn't a consideration. It was considered that women, if they're married, they bring in a little extra cash with illustration work. And this had become so important. And here's a woman's drawing class. Women were not allowed to see nude models. But they worked from plaster casts, like you see the foot and the heads and different things like that. And this was at Drexel, which is now a university. It was a trade school in the 19th century. So Howard Pyle had already established himself as a prominent illustrator by the time he began teaching at Drexel. And one of the things, and he had huge classes, and he did object to all the women in the classes. He said there was a woman that used to knit and drove him crazy. She'd sit there knitting. And he just felt, I'm dealing with these amateurs. And so eventually what he did is he started doing private teaching at his place at Chats Ford near Wilmington, and it's in the Brandywine Valley. There's a wonderful museum there now, the Brandywine Museum, if you're ever, it's wonderful stuff. And then that's where he's from. And that whole art colony that started around Howard Pyle there. Because he felt that, so what he would do is that he would pick the very best students and invite them to his private atelier to work. and they would reside there. And he never accepted any money for it. It was something because he got a lot of money on his illustrations. He made a lot of money. And so he thought, this is my contribution back to the field. I want to teach basic stuff. You got to know perspective. You got to know light and shade. You have to already be able to draw. I want to work on developing the imagination of advanced students. So he had never more than a dozen students at a time. And there were 3 studios he set up, one for the very beginners, one that was kind of intermediate, and then one that just had 1 or 2 of the top students. And eventually he would kick them out of the nest, and they were on their own. But he had a lot of contacts. So he was not just educating them on how to be a good artist, but he also had contacts in the publishing industry so he could get them jobs. And so this is very important. So that was an important aspect of it, of his thing. And so one of the things he wanted to do was to masculinize the industry. And I want to mention Michelle Bogart because I don't want you to think that I'm a sexist that's up here telling these things. It's really a woman art historian who brought this thing to mind. And once again, the women art historians are kind of the women illustrators are kind of forgotten as women tend to be in the history of art. Okay, so here's Howard Pyle. Oh, this is not B. Howard Pyle. That was from earlier notes. The rapid development of the new technology printing. Pyle, well, we're going to kind of do this chronologically, but I want to talk about his students as well because he's really well known as a teacher. This is him with kind of the boys, and some of his top students, including N.C. Wyeth, the second from the left, Ralph Schoonover, a couple others that went on to become very famous artists. And this is some of his students painting outdoors. He did have female students sometimes, but he said that if you get married, it's all over because you'll be raising babies and you won't have time to devote yourself fully to art history. And he actually there were some, and I did lecture on this before the plague here, on the Red Rose Girls. I don't know if you saw that. But there were these 4 female students that said, okay, we're not going to ever get married. And they decided to live together and do their art. And they, and so kind of an unusual family of these, women artists. And there's pictures of them smoking cigars and stuff, they're trying to be real, try to enter into that world. But it was very unusual. But see, that's why he felt that once you get involved with the family, child raising and that, you're going to be an amateur. You're only going to be able to do it on the side. You got to be able to devote yourself full time to it. Okay, now, photo engraving was the first big thing that came out after the Civil War as a new way of reproducing images. And engravings, and this is a close-up of an engraving is done usually with a metal plate, and you just use a tool just to engrave little lines in the plate. And then eventually what you do is when all the lines have been put in, you ink up the plate, you wipe the plate so that the ink only stays in the grooves, and then you put it through a press. And so when you're trying to achieve grays, middle tones and shadows, it has to be done by what's called cross-hatching. And you can see that, I wonder if I can get my little, no, I can't get it to work. But you can see how he does lines like this and then cross-hatches them like that. And if you get far enough away from it, it gives the illusion of a tonal of gray. And the dollar bill, of course, is an engraving. If you look very closely at dollar bill, you'll see that really doesn't have those grays. It has all those blacks and whites. Now, during the Civil War, they developed wood engraving, which wood is easier to work than the metal. But they would make wood engravings and then electroplate them and then there would be a plate that came out of it that way. And that was faster than engraving. But what happened in the 70s is with the use of photographic equipment, they found that they could reproduce much, much more quickly and more efficiently with better quality if they used this system of photo engraving. So what they would do is they would take the drawing, the original pen and ink drawing or whatever it was, and it had to be linear, like this. It can't reproduce grays. And bu- 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 and I lost my train of thought again. These in between grays would be mixed kind of this way. Oh, I know. Okay. So what you do is you take this and you make a photograph of it. Then you take the negative of the photograph, and the negative, all the black lines become white and all the white areas become black. So it's a reversal. And you put up a piece of the metal that has been treated with resin that's light sensitive. You put it in a darkened room because it's light sensitive, just like a dark room, and you project the negative onto the plate. And that chemical action happens there that it kind of melts the rosin, and then you put it in a bath of acid and it etches the lines in. So that you can go from a drawing in one step to ready to print thing, and it can print many, many, many of them. So you get a plate that's the work is done by photographer, not really by etching or anything like that. This has really revolutionized the industry in many different ways. So that you could have sketch artists that went, let's say there's a fire downtown, and they go and they sketch it in pen and ink, work it up. They could take a photo of it, and that afternoon it could be published in the newspaper. And that's very, very fast. We're used to instant things now, right? But that you could do the drawing in the morning and it appears in the afternoon, that was incredible turnaround time. And it's only possible because of this new technology related to photography. It's not really a photograph, it's a photograph of a work of art. And one of the things that really put him on the map was Robin Hood. Which is still in print. It's never gone out of print since he first published it. And he did all the illustrations for it, and he wrote it as well. He was a writer as well. Mostly he's remembered for children's and adolescent books. He tried some adult things that they never quite gelled. But he's very good with children. And look at all this decorative work was all done in pen. It didn't need to be engraved on a plate because it could be done photographically. And because the paper was wood pulp paper, it was inexpensive and you could be bound and you could get a lot of copies of this. I want to just show some illustrations from it, just to pick out a few of them because it's profusely illustrated. This is the Merry Friar carries Robin across the water. Robin Hood they were brigands who basically were highway robbers. But of course the difference with Robin Hood, because he's good, is that they take from the rich and they give to poor. They don't just take from the rich and then keep it for themselves, but they turn around and help the destitute and widows and all that sort of stuff. So there's this moral underpinning. And to heighten this spiritual dimension of their thievery, one of them is a priest, Friar Tuck. And so he blesses their endeavors and prays for them and their work, and he sees it as holy. So it's interesting that he's taken these, these thieves and kind of making them into these good guys. And here's some the illustrations. A beautiful command of anatomy and so forth. And you can see the weight of the figures, the command of the perspective, and the wonderful decorative elements that surround everything. Look at this, these flowering forms, and the hand lettering that also looks medieval, right? He's looking closely at medieval art to try to kind of create that spirit of medieval art. Here's another one where Friar Tuck has been drinking, I guess. I guess it's allowed to do that. And you can see he's the Merry Friar sings a goodly song, it says. And you can see his monogram there, that HP. Signatures became really big at one point where because these guys became like rock stars. They really were. They wanted their autograph. Oh, there's Howard Pyle. He's kind of a thing. So remember, this is before the internet, before a lot of that sort of stuff. So these guys really became personalities because books were everything. There weren't movies. Photography was rare, and But books were something, especially now, they were affordable, everybody could have them. And it was a family thing where the whole family would sit around and together read a book as opposed to watching a TV show, I suppose. Here's another one. Just the level of detail, in these things. And if you had to engrave them, it would have taken him years, right? But he was able to just kind of produce them. It's interesting that he has a colleague of his, Edwin Austin Abbey. He was a protege of Charlie Parsons. Charles Parsons was the editor of Harper's Weekly, a big weekly newspaper during the Civil War. Then after the war, Harper's turned into a big publishing firm that did books and magazines and everything else. And he was in on the ground floor. And so he was really the benefactor of Pyle, as well as Austin Abbey. And Austin Abbey liked to do Shakespeare. So he said, you've got to go to England to see what the little Hamlets and stuff like that. And he sent them there, because he had money and he was a old-fashioned mentor. And Austin writes to Pyle and says, get him to send you to Germany, so you can see these little things. And he says, no, I don't want to go there. It would ruin it for me. I want to have it completely of my imagination. He didn't even like New York. He just wanted to go back to Chad's Ford. So he's a very kind of modest person in some ways. He did another, also this photo engraving thing called Auto of the Silver Hand. And here, again, there's a priest in it. But what he does here a lot in trying to make it look medieval is he either has profiles or full face, which is kind of a medievalizing, flattening out sort of thing. But they're incredible, they're just incredibly done. And they really have the look of like Renaissance woodcuts. And here's an interesting one. This is Otto in his study. He's a priest. And here is an engraving that obviously he looked at. And this engraving is from the 1520s, and it's by Albrecht Dürer, the great Renaissance artist. And it's Erasmus, the humanist scholar, the Dutch Netherlander scholar. But look at how, look at the way Dürer stylizes the folds in the garments. It's exactly the same, So he was a master at doing different styles. And so when he's doing a book about the Middle Ages, he wants it to have the authentic look of the Middle Ages, right? And this is part of his imagination thing. He said that his academic training, he said, was no good because he said all we talked about was perspective and light and shade and all that. We never talked about the imagination. It was always copying stuff, copying. So that's, but good for him because he copied enough that he was able to imitate different styles and use this as in his repertoire. I hope this isn't going too fast for you, but the stuff is great. And I think the technological stuff is interesting. I hope you don't find it boring because, specialists get into things. But the next phase is very interesting. It's called the screened photograph. Now what they did is they take a photograph. They could reproduce photographs now in newspapers or anywhere else you have the enlarger and you have the photosensitive paper down here, and you put a screen in between them, and it has to be the right focal length, and it will reduce the photograph to a series of dots that come through the screen. And I'm going to blow this up for you so you can see this. Now, this is not from the 1880s. This is, 1950s newspaper or something like that, but I just brought it as an example of, you see how when you see it smaller, it looks like a whole range of grays. When you blow it really up big, you can see that screen that makes everything into net. And so you give more of a feeling for this. This is one of the very first photographs appearing, I think, in the New York Times, in the 1870s. And it's a shanty town on the edge of town, just, unclaimed property that people put up cardboard boxes, homeless people and stuff like this. And this was a screen photograph, and I want to show you, you get really close, you can really see the screen, right? This one wasn't a screen of round screen, but it was kind of this other kind of screen. They had to play with it a little while to get it to do, but by the mid-80s, it was, you were really, 1880s that is, you had the full-blown thing like this. And this is from a series of poems by this man named Howell. And he and Pyle had this thing in common. You can see it's a reference to death. the poet with his laurel is asking how much longer. And I guess that's the muse of time, holding an hourglass and then a sigh in the other hand, as a symbol of harvesting and of death. So he's kind of wondering, how much longer do I get? And you see the skull and the bottom and so forth. Again, if you get really close, you can see that it's all a series of dots. It's all done through the screen. And now our screening is more sophisticated than it was then. But even then, this was amazing to have a full blood. So he would make a painting of it and photograph it and shoot the photograph through a screen. So it would reduce it to a series of dots. Now, a thing that's interesting with Howell's is that both Pyle and Howell lost a son. And Pyle's son was 6 years old. He really hit him very, very, very hard. And it shows in his work. There's a lot of stuff that is yearning kind of toward death and stuff in this fantasiacal kind of thing. There's an interesting book that he does, a children's book called The Angel Behind the Moon. And this boy walks across, how the moon shines on the water and makes this sort of path. He walks on the path and goes to find the world that's behind the moon of angels and pixies and all different sorts of things. And here he is with the man in the moon, looking at the little things. Again, this one of this angel, but see, it's just a little boy. He was interesting. His parents were raised. He was raised as Swedenborgian, and Swedenborgian was a Protestant mystic that had all these visions of the soul's journey to heaven or hell and the afterlife and all these different things. And one of the things Swedenborgians believe is if a child dies, they grow to full maturity in the afterlife, finding their way to heaven or whatever. And so that's kind of what the story is about. It's a children's story, but it's very much kind of him coming to terms with the loss of his son and what that means. And imagine him living on in this afterlife with the angel behind the moon. Here's another one. They're just wonderful. They're just beautiful. Boy. Yeah, it's really, we're used to just swashbucklers and stuff. And when he really becomes romantic, it can be just breathtaking. Here's a wonderful one of the angel behind the moon. Isn't that just lovely? She has a little incense burner there, a lily in her hand, a poet's laurel around her head. It's interesting that, angels underwent a sex change in the 19th century, a gender change. Because in the Renaissance and Baroque, angels are young men. They're shown as young men with wings. They're, they don't have beards and so forth. These are young men. They're kind of idealized, kind of androgynous. But in the 19th century, we begin to have, in Victorian times, the idea of a kind of a female angel. That became kind of the dominant way of thinking. And so this reflects that. But he's a marvelous painter. Then the next thing that came in, and this is really the last of the technical things I'll bore you with, but the 4-color separation process. Once they figured out that black and white could be done with a screen, they found that if they took a full color picture and they separated the primary colors, the red, the blue, and the yellow, and then they also would use black, and white was the white of the paper, they would make a series of dots that they'd run it through. It was called the 4-color process: red, blue, yellow, black. And so you'd have a full color thing. That comes out of the post-impressionist Georges Seurat, who was painting in the 1880s, the Isle of Grange. And he does all these little tiny dots. Now, this is not reproduction, but I'll show you another one. Here's one really blown up of a little head from another painting by Seurat. Although Seurat really didn't make things to be printed, this was not lost on printmakers and photographers. And so what they started to do, you find things like this. And this is really modern. The same way that you'll find color reproduction done now is still this 4-color process where they take only the red from the story or from the face, or only the blue, only the yellow, and then make them a series of dots, and when you get enough away, it's visual blending that happens. And you can see here, you can imagine, squint your eye, you can see how if you reduce this in size. This is another thing that illustrators became used to doing too. It's a real trick, is because when you're doing photo engraving, you can make it any size you want to, depending on how far back the projector is. See? So what happened was that a lot of people would work bigger and then shrink it down, so that little tiny details that would show up in a larger one would reproduce well in smaller. And so illustrators, even today, they think kind of in bigger terms and realize their work will be reduced eventually for book form. So by the time the 4-color process came out, and look at this, I mean, complete full color. And it's hard to believe that it's only been run through the press 4 times. But as I said, there's a filter put in the photograph to separate out the red and the blue and the yellow. And so you get, and he does a lot of pirates. He likes pirates as well. Here's someone walking the gangplank in the pirate story. Now it's interesting too, you know, because he's such a famous illustrator by the 1890s that he can pick and choose what stories he'll do. And he does pick like boys' adventure stories, like Robin Hood, like pirates, like those. And it's interesting that he's attracted, and he writes a little bit. He doesn't write a lot, but he writes a little bit. There was an introduction to a book in the 1890s, and he wrote kind of an introductory essay, and it was very interesting. He said that there's this savage part of man that wants blood and violence and wants to see all this kind of thing, and that's kind of latent in everybody. And he brings it out in art so that people can experience it vicariously. So he is attracted to violence not because he's a violent man, because he wasn't at all, but because that kind of you can kind of get that out of your system that way. And I think it's interesting because he's talking about the savage, you know, primitive, primal nature of man that is it comes out in pirate stories and swashbuckler and murder mysteries and things like that. Freud is saying almost the same thing at almost the same time, in which he calls the id. You know, there's this animal kind of this instinctual basis that you know. So it's interesting how Howard Pyle, and I don't think he was reading Freud, but it's that you know that they're very similar in some ways in that sense. And he does a lot of these, you know, like the looking at this from below gives it such a wonderful dynamic character. He also did a bunch of illustrations about the Revolutionary War, and as well as Teddy Roosevelt's invasion of Cuba. He did illustrations for that thing. Here's one of you know, of the young volunteers at the beginning of the Civil War. I want to point out too how painterly he is, how his brushwork is virtuosic, how much it looks kind of like Impressionism from 10 years earlier. It has a freshness. It isn't dwell on those details like the classicists that he was rebelling against. This is one of my favorite ones. They've been ambushed, and here's one of his interesting principles, because he's a great pedagogue. And once he says is that you want to put dark colors with dark colors, light colors with light colors, medium colors with medium colors, except in the place that you want the viewer to go to first. And there you should have very, very high contrast between light and dark. Doesn't matter what the colors are, right? And here, your face is drawn to this man who's looking at us. You know, like, what's wrong with you? Pick up your gun. We're being ambushed, right? You can see that on his face. But that white face inside that black hat against the white shirt of the man behind him makes that the highest contrast point in the picture. Now, if you go to the left, you'll see a whole kind of bunch of people that kind of form, there are a whole bunch of dark forms. And the same thing over here. There's a wounded person. And here, of course, he puts the church to show the moral moral superiority, the moral position of the revolutionaries. They're not brigands, they're revolutionaries. But I think it's amazing how much he can, and see that all this area behind of green is is of a different contrast. Now, what are we doing on time? Near the end of his life, and he dies in 1910, when it comes to the turn of the century, he's very successful and he just takes whatever he wants to as far as assignments, because he has, millions of people who want his work. But he starts working large. He starts getting commissions to do murals because he's so well known. They think, why not, do this big? So here's for example, is one of the paintings in situ, and this is of a battle from the Civil War. And it was commissioned by Cass Gilbert, who's an architect, who did the Woolworth Building in downtown Manhattan in 1913. But he also did the state capitol in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was built during this time, and he knew if Pyle and asked Pyle if he would do a mural-sized painting. And he did this one, and you can see it up there at the Civil War. I just want to put it in the context of this, kind of gaudy 19th century Beaux-Arts architecture, but here it is. And it's very, he's Howard Pyle he's amazing. Yeah, and he captures the action and the smoke, a little bit of the snow, he's wonderful. But, and I went to see this, I'm from Minnesota, so when I was visiting my dad, I went to see this, but he had a hard time working on this mural. And I think one of the problems is he's used to composing and then having it shrunk down. And now he has to kind of think in the opposite way. He has to think small that can be blown up. And when he blows it up, this is a masterful mural, but he gets so stuck in the details of every blade of grass and that it doesn't have the kind of dramatic input that the kind of dramatic readability and clarity, because it gets so busy with these different things, because he's used to working things and then making them smaller instead of making them bigger. So he finally decided that what he's got to do, if he's going to pursue this new challenge, is to make murals, right? A lot of public buildings going up, and there's a lot of jobs for that, and he's the most famous living illustrator there is. And he had never gone to Europe. He never went anywhere. He really, all his pirates and everything were all in his brain. But then finally he said, I have to go to Europe because I have to see the Renaissance painters. I got to see Raphael. I got to see Masaccio. I've got to see how these guys solve these problems. And I can't see them as little pictures in books. I've got to see them on that scale so that I begin to think that way. Think small, make big. So he decided to go to Italy, and he goes to Florence, and he writes to his students, and here's an old photograph of the baptistry in front of the Duomo in Florence from the 1880s. I got an old photograph of horse and buggy. Doesn't look like this anymore. There's no horse and buggy. The rest of everything is there. And he wrote back, and his students said, I was wrong. I was wrong. Italy is incredible. Seeing these works and on the wall, and you take trips to Rome to see the Raphaels in the Vatican, and he's just completely blown away. And he said, this is really the opening to a whole new phase in my career. And he was just hitting 50, right? And 50 used to sound real old when I was young, but now 50 sounds young. And he went to Florence. He lived there for a year, writing back and forth to his students. And then he got ill and had a flu and died in Florence. He's buried in Florence. And it's sad because he just seemed like he was on the brink of this whole new thing, and then he dies. So it's kind of a tragic loss because, he wasn't that old. And he certainly had established himself. Here's another one of these old pictures of the what's the name of this piazza? Palazzo Vecchio, around in there. Okay, so I'm going to open up for questions. This is my website. If you want to go see, I do a lot of libraries, churches, synagogues, different things like that. By the way, this adult education, I'm beginning to see that adult education, I think, is more important than my university teaching or my publishing. Because I reach people that I don't in the class. You're here because you want to be here. Some of my students, they're here because they have to take art history, you know, don't have to read any undergraduate badly written papers. I don't have to grade tests. So it's just the fun part when I'm doing adult education. And you know, one of my great heroes is a Jewish thinker, Franz Rosenzweig, a German Jewish writer, who actually gave up an academic position, a tenured position, so that he could do full-time adult education for Jewish audiences. And I think that's really amazing, because I would never give up my tenured job to do that. But that's how important it was to Rosenzweig. He thought this is the most important aspect of my work, is reaching people in this way. And one of my missions, I guess, from God, or one of my things is, I hate snobbery. Snobbery. I hate when I go into galleries in Chelsea and there's those people doing this, and I feel like, honey, you just answer the phones, you know, like, don't get too, you know, involved with yourself. And I feel that art, and especially 20th century, 19th century, 20th century art, it's not so hard that people can't get it. They just need a little bit of context to put it in so that they can interpret them for themselves. And then, so that's kind of what and as I move closer to retirement, I'm doing more and more adult education, because I'm beginning to see that it's very important indeed. Okay, let's open it up then for questions. Maybe we can
Sure, take some
hook
lights.
up the lights.
We
Yeah.
have some questions and comments here. First of all, though, thank you so much, Dennis. That was a terrific talk, really terrific talk.
I hope the technical part didn't
Not at
you
all.
like that. I tried to make it as clear as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that gave us the full picture, it gave us the full
Yeah.
understanding there. Absolutely. We have a question over here, and then we have some on the chat.
Wyeth was a pupil of his,
Yeah, no, Newell Converse Weiler, the father of Andrew Wyeth.
the father of Andrew
Father
Wyeth,
of Andrew Wyeth was actually, and he did a lot of the same sort of stuff.
because they were illustrators of children's books and
Yes,
so on.
and pirates and all that stuff too.
That's right.
N.C. Wyeth, yeah, he's great. And now he's kind of eclipsed by his more famous son, because the son is really not an illustrator. The son is a painter, you know. But see, the thing is that it's funny how illustration has been seen as like the less talented brother of painting or something. You know what I mean? Like there's Picasso, and then
Yeah.
there's Norman
You
Rockwell.
see his illustrations at the Brandywine Museum and the
Oh, it's wonderful.
paintings.
Oh, it's
there.
wonderful. And actually, the architecture there is very interesting too. It's
Yeah.
a mixture of different things. And the Brandywine Valley is just beautiful. I mean, you really understand. Yes, the father was a pupil, yeah. In fact, almost 100 illustrators moved through his private school over the course of his career. So that's a lot of people. That's a lot of influence.
So let me get to some of what we have here in the chat. Someone commented that George Innes was
Yes.
a disciple of Swedenborgianism.
Oh, he
My
was?
goodness.
I didn't realize that. I don't know too much about Swedenborgianism. However, it's Protestant. It's not Catholic mysticism. We usually think of Catholics as being more mystical, you know, with the nuns and visions and stuff like that. But there are Protestant mystics, and the Swedenborgian sect or denomination was very kind of mystical and very concerned with the afterlife. And it's kind of a weird thing that he was, kind of a quirky thing that he was into, because he did believe in life after death. And I think, you know, he was a good, you know, Protestant.
Yeah.
And you know, this is another thing I found out too, is that when I've been doing, well, not only illustration, but modern art in general, is that there's a much greater spiritual dimension to a lot of 19th and 20th century art than mostly people are given credit for. And it's because my field is very secularized. You know, it's a very secularized field. So like, for example, Mark Rothko, the great abstract painter, is just very mystical and everything. You know, and I see it as these kind of icons of the unrepresentable Jewish God, and you know, these mystical kind of doorways. Or you've probably seen his work. And what was my point there? Oh, you know, and I say that these are, you know, these are doorways to the eternal. And other art historians would say, well, Dennis, if that's what you need to believe to enjoy Rothko. But it's really all about color and form and composition and depth. And I realize all those things are there. But when you read Rothko's letters, he says, I am concerned with the timeless and the tragic. This is romantic stuff. You see what I mean? So that there's a much greater spirituality to a lot of this than we usually realize. And because I think my colleagues are just, it's a very secularized field. If you get into Renaissance art, it's more spiritualized. You'll find more believers in there. But in the 20th century, you don't find that as much.
So we have a couple more things here in the chat.
Yeah.
A question. The mural that Pyle did was astounding. Do you know what he used as a basis for the work, or was it completely out of his creative mind?
No, it was all out of his creative mind. He, you know, in fact, one of the things with his students, he said, I don't want you using models. You've got to be able to, you have to know drawing well enough that he's not going to teach you perspective or anything. But yeah.
Wow. Yeah, we have another question here. Hold on one sec.
He dies in 1910, so I guess he must be born around 1850. Maybe 48, 50, something like that.
And there's some more stuff here in the chat. Let me run back over here. So a number of people have said that they, as far as these presentations being adult education, yes, you are right. I'm loving these classes. Someone else appreciated the technical explanations very much. The technical part is very important to me. Thank you. Another question. Have you seen the exhibit on illustrator Ethel Reed at the Poster House?
Not yet, but that Poster House is in Chelsea. And it's a very interesting place for illustration because it shows illustration from earlier in the century. I know they had an illustrator from Weimar, Germany, who ended up dying in a death camp and stuff because he was Jewish, but they showed his work. So you see, these posters are another form of commercial art. They're a form of popular art. And there's this kind of elitism in the fine arts that thinks if it's popular, it's not good. Isn't that a weird prejudice? It's a weird prejudice, especially for a social historian of art. And actually, I know why. Let's see if I can do it in 30 seconds. The modernists in Europe were kind of kooks on the margins of the discourse. They had shows, but they were limited success. However, the dictators hated modern art, all of them. Fascists, Nazis, Stalin, they all hated. So they came to America during the war, during the Second World War, and they stayed. And now they weren't kooks on the margin of the discourse. They were freedom fighters who had stood up to the dictators. So they were lionized. So the whole history of art was sort of turned on its head so that the avant-garde became the most important thing. And one of the things the avant-garde is when they came into power in that period after the war, after the Second World War, they were angry that they had been left out. And they used illustration and anything popular to say, yes, we're highbrow and we're not vulgar, popular kind of stuff. You see what I mean? So there began to be this, there was an essay written by Clement Greenberg, a critic, called Avant-Garde and Kitsch from 1939 to the beginning of this. And he said, what kind of concept of culture can we have a Braque painting and a Norman Rockwell painting? What sort of understanding of culture is going to make any sense of this? And his answer was, the Braque is good, the Rockwell is bad. Rockwell is kitsch. It's easy to get, it's simple, it's makes you happy or feel good or whatever, and real art is deeper and all that sort of stuff. That's a very unfair. I wrote a paper called Neither Avant-Garde Nor Kitsch that I presented at a conference a few years ago. Because they don't have to be, there's room in the discourse for Jackson Pollock and for Norman Rockwell. There's no reason that one has to be disparaged in terms of the other. You see what I mean? But that was the polemics of 1945. It was, are we going to be able to survive? And the only way we're going to be able to survive is sort of to push all this lowbrow stuff out. Well, I happen to like the lowbrow stuff, but I don't want to throw out Picasso. That's throwing bath out with a baby out with the bathwater. See, I just want to expand it. We don't have to, we all know that modern art is valid, so we don't have to prove that anymore by showing how superior it is to something. See what I mean? So I'm coming at it from a very postmodern aspect because I see it as just, it's there. And I don't have any axe to grind. I just think it's all interesting, you know, and it should all be part of one big picture, even if it's a little complicated and messy.
So Dennis, another question along those same lines for, as you described, illustration and illustrators kind of being given, you know, a second-class status. Do you feel that's true today still? Is there movement happening in that?
Well, it's still very much its own world. I found when I get to know illustrators, they're a whole different sort of thing than fine artists. They kind of have their own networking system, their own art directors and stuff. And so it does have this separateness to it. It has retained that. And I think there's still a snob element that anything that's popular is not good. But that's not a valid way of looking at things. It really isn't. I'm a popular, well, those people hate me because I'm a popularizer. You know, you're taking this sacred stuff and you're making it popular. I feel like that's the whole point, you know? And the thing is, if you read the artists, if you talk to the illustrators, they're not highfalutin. They're very down to earth. Just to give you an example, though, of a tragic thing, is I suppose you've probably heard of not Charlie Russell, Frederick Remington. The illustrator in the 19th century does a lot of cowboys and Indians and stuff like that. You've heard of him, maybe. Remington, yeah. Well, Remington, there was, you know, Remington kind of faked a Western accent and stuff like that. He's kind of a salesman and a very great artist, too. But he always felt this inferiority, you know, that I'm not quite a painter, I'm not quite a painter. And wanted to, eventually he got a magazine to show his paintings without any text. Because then he thought, like, now it's not an illustration. But the fine art still didn't accept that. You know, that's real. But anyway, there was a damning review of his show. And they called, I think the name of it was Wild West Faker. And it said, this guy is from Jersey, he's from New Rochelle. He's only been to the West a couple times. You know, he fakes this accent, and it's all just part of a false thing that he's putting on to impress people. And he's a phony. And he took a bunch of his work and made a bonfire in the backyard and burned it because of that review. And I felt like, my God. So that's how insecure Frederick Remington was at the height of his fame and fortune. He still could never quite be accepted as a painter. Although, you know, the illustrators use paint. But how we define it differently in our book, it's separated from sign painters, for example, which some of them are beautiful too, or from cartooning, is that we talk about illustration as something that was made to be reproduced. Okay, so there's a lot of reproductions of the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel, right? You can get them T-shirts and in Italy, that, you know, all over the place. But it's not an illustration because it was conceived of as a painting. Later on, it was made into, you know, reproduced, but it wasn't designed to be reproduced. All the stuff we saw today was designed to be reproduced. It warns that he never had an art show of his work. He never had the feeling of art for art's sake. He always felt like, no, I have a job, I'm an illustrator, I'm trying to, you know, he had a lot of a moral feeling about responsibility of the artist to society. And there were, of course, there were things he wouldn't take. You know, he didn't have to do advertising of junk that he didn't like because he, you know, was famous enough he didn't have to do that. Anyway, does that,
Yeah, definitely. Well, again, I don't think we have any other questions or comments there in the chat. Just checking if anybody else here has a comment. I want to thank you again, Dennis. I know that we've talked about continuing with, I hope people did enjoy this, focusing on illustration here, that we've discussed having you continue to give some further
we could
talks
do
on
that.
illustration.
And I tell you that realist side is what came out in the early decades of the 20th century as the Ashcan School, it's called, which wasn't a real school, but it shows like just regular people at Coney Island and stuff like that. But those guys, and they ended up being painters, you know, but a lot of people don't realize that all those guys were illustrators first. They were newspaper men. And that's how they learned their reportorial kind of realism. And then it was Robert Henry who was able to talk them into translating it over into painting. But they started off as illustrators. Same thing with Homer, Winslow Homer. You know, Winslow Homer was a field artist during the Civil War. So a lot of artists got, but then they were able to kind of graduate. Like once Homer was making a living at painting, then he didn't do illustration anymore. Because even he had that idea in his mind, like Frederick Remington, that it's lesser. And I don't. To me, it's all interesting stuff, you know.
Well, I have to thank you because it's always such a treat to have us understand and read some of the art through your eyes and through your instruction.
Well, thank you.
So terrific talk today. And thank you again. Thank you everybody for being here. I hope you all have a great weekend. And again, Dennis, great to have you back here in person as well.
We'll see you again.
Thanks everybody.